troublesome prophets, Amos and John, unsettling power, infuriating rulers, one exiled, the other executed. I wished, as I read John O'Donoghue's blessing, that Herod had heard those words of encouragement. Respond to the call of your gift and the courage to follow its path. Let the flame of anger free you of all falsity. It's strange, really, that in the midst of Mark's Gospel, as urgent and as concise as it is, that John the Baptist should again interrupt the story of Jesus' mission and ministry. Yes, it was important to hear that John baptized Jesus and inaugurated his ministry. But why does Mark tell this terrible tale of John's interactions with Herod Antipas and his dysfunctional family? Why is this text of terror inserted into the middle of Jesus' story between the commissioning of the disciples and the feeding of the 5,000 in the Jewish community and the 4,000 in the Gentile community? Why is it there just before those stories of feeding and feasting, joyful stories? But John's horrible, violent death occurs in the context of a feast too. Australian New Testament theologian Bill Loader suggests that Mark connects the three feasts under the rubric of bread. Readers of Mark would doubtless have made the connection with the Eucharist. The feedings of the 5,000 and 4,000 foreshadow that meal of life through death. Herod's Feast is a counterpoint. It is an anti-Eucharist. John's head is brought forward on a platter at the height of this macabre liturgy. The effect of Herod's banquet is to colour the other two. There is a solidarity between John the Baptist, Jesus and the disciples, because powerful forces will seek to exterminate all of them. The passage invites reflection on the terror of human vulnerability to corrupt regimes, where decisions of enormous consequence can be influenced by fickle behaviour. The family relationships in Herod's family need a bit of explaining, though, before we go on. In part because by the time the author of Mark's Gospel had heard the stories, a few historical inaccuracies had crept in and names and relationships had got muddled. So this Herod is Herod Antipas, son of King Herod the Great, who slaughtered the innocent children in Matthew 2. Today's Herod wasn't actually a king, but rather a governor in Galilee and Perea from 4 BCE to 39 CE. Herod's first wife was Petra, the daughter of Aretas, king of the Nabateans. However, while staying with his half-brother, also confusingly called Herod, en route to Rome, Herod Antipas had an affair with Herodias, wife of his half-brother, and later married her, divorcing his first wife. Confusingly again, Mark's story calls that half-brother Philip. So that Herod Philip and Herodias already had a daughter called Salome, and she's called Salome in the other versions of the story. But Mark's story appears to assume that she is a daughter of the new marriage to Herod Antipas, but that's unlikely given the fact that she's a young woman in the story. And in fact, we know from other sources that Salome, the daughter, was married to someone else who, confusingly, was called Philip. No wonder Mark got confused. And then even worse, Mark seems to call her Herodias, which was her mother's name. And the Herodias, whom Herod Antipas married, was in fact his niece, being the daughter of another of his half-brothers. So it's this complex, messy, unfaithful family situation that attracted the attention of John the Baptist. But the odd thing in the story is that Herod seemed interested in and attracted to the preaching of John the Baptist. I can't say I've ever really seen the attraction. John seems preoccupied with harsh accusations and calls to repentance. Yet it seems that Herod found himself admiring John almost in spite of himself. We are not told where and how they first encountered each other, but we are told that Herod doesn't quite know what to make of John. On the one hand, he seems almost afraid of him, and on the other hand, we hear that he liked to listen to John. But despite this interest and attraction, I suppose it comes as no surprise that in the end, Herod had his reputation, his power, his pride to protect. So when John crossed the line and his criticism became personal, and he confronted Herod about his violation of the Levitical law prohibiting marrying a brother's wife, Herod had him put in prison. And the story spirals then into farce and horror. It doesn't take much to let our imaginations picture the scene of an extravagant birthday party, where as the wine flowed freely, inhibitions and tongues were also loosened. Pretty soon, Herod is promising the young, dancing Salome anything she wants. And then Herod finds himself backed into a corner. He doesn't appear to have the courage or the moral strength to weigh the difference between a promise made in a drunken show of extravagance and one that is more carefully thought out. At this point, Herod seems to care only about his reputation, and so he keeps his hastily made promise to Salome, and before we know it, John's life is ended in the most gruesome way. His severed head is brought to the party on a platter. It is a terrible story, not just for its gruesome, gory ending, but also for the machinations of power and the structures of injustice that it displays. The point of the story is not, as many Christian preachers have often claimed, about the dangers of women as sexual temptresses. It should rather be seen as a story of exploitation, of women, citizens and slaves, a story about silencing the cry for justice. The story tells of John's preaching, which dares to confront the political power and the sexual excesses of Herod. Evil is named in the centres of power, political and religious. The strong, driven by forces of money, sex and power, lord over those who are weak. In this passage, we are forced to face a world that is in opposition to the innocent, a world where injustice and brutal power prevail. The text, you might remember, opens with speculation about where Jesus' power and that of his disciples come from. It ends with John's disciples claiming his beheaded body and burying it. The story begins with power and ends with powerlessness. When I hear this story in the context of our time, I cannot but think of Professor Gillian Triggs, President of the Human Rights Commission, and also of the hundreds of doctors and aid workers who are speaking out against the Border Force Act, which makes it illegal for them to tell of the harm being done to asylum seekers in offshore detention centres. In March of this year, an independent review into sexual abuse inside Australia's detention centre on Nauru found evidence of rape, sexual assault of minors, and guards trading marijuana for sexual favours from female detainees. The response of the government has been to vilify those who tell these truths and to pass a law that makes this truth-telling illegal and punishable by up to 2 years in prison. How exactly does informing the Australian public that a guard has raped an asylum seeker threaten national security? Those who are speaking out are people with a degree of power, with the status of leaders and doctors, but they are people who are risking their power to side with the weak. It is very clear that the powerful would like nothing better than to serve Gillian Trigg's head up on a plate. What is happening even now echoes this ancient story from our past of power being maintained at the expense of the whistleblower. This bizarre story of John's death casts a shadow over what is to come. We are told this story because Herod freaks out when he hears about Jesus. He is afraid that John, whom he has killed, has been raised up. He is terrified that while the messenger has been killed, the truth has refused to die. And soon, fickle, exploitative political powers will perform another convenient execution, reflecting arbitrary individual choice and reflecting structures of injustice. Mark's readers may have made the connection between themselves and Herod's wondering, can something so callously executed come to life again? Is the risen Jesus to be seen where such powers are confronted anew, whether within us as individuals or among us in our society? Or does the entertainment drown out the voices? I began by asking why John keeps showing up in Mark's Gospel. I think it must be because he points the way to Jesus, crucified and risen. Risen in solidarity and resistance to anything and everything that diminishes life. Risen in the brave ones who speak truth to powerful evil, regardless of its consequences. Risen even in us when we resist the temptation to please everyone around us at the expense of our own standards and truths. Because lives are at stake when we make these choices, even our own. But in this story, there is also a word of grace. Stories like the execution of John shatter our numbness and break into our apparently ordered world with images of violence, transcendence, and grace. They give us a lens with which to refocus the relentless media stories of needless deaths and the slaughter of innocents. This is also a story that can help us address our personal texts of terror. The death of those we loved, the brokenness of relationships, our fears for our children, our concerns about our health, the directions of our lives, the reality of abuse, past and present. This story of the beheading of John shows us how to read our own tragic stories, personal and communal. We are asked to speak them, to let them affect us, to make them visible to one another in community. The story reminds us that being human requires us to dwell, at least for a while, in the tragedy. But there is grace that can be found in the margins of the text. In the marginal places, the presence of grace can be felt, waiting to be accepted or rejected. But it is grace that does not downplay or gloss over pain or the horror of evil. Like John's disciples, we are invited to come and claim the body. It is when we approach the body, when we behold the scars and the devastation with sighs too deep for words, that we will begin to sense and know resurrection. We are drawn back to the sacred source of life, not in a way that is naive about suffering, not to be escapist, but faithfully claiming the body and the heart of our faith, believing that in that presence and with abundant grace, all things will be made new. Herod's story reminds us that the truth does not die, even when the person who speaks the truth has died. For the truth told of the real meaning of our lives, constituted in love and justice, passion and compassion, will outlive all that seeks to silence it. It lives among us now in the risen Christ, in Christa community, in all who follow the way, including in us. Blessed be.